Good afternoon and welcome to the second in our series at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on securing the manufacturing base for AI and as it relates to data center development. Today is the second in our series. Again, we're having a discussion moderated by Lucian Niemeyer, who's the CEO of Building Cybersecurity. And he's brought in a couple of guests to talk to their expertise and the work that they are doing in their communities. Potomac Institute, we're a data-driven policy organization focused at the intersection of business and government as it relates to science and technology policy. And so as the Genesis mission is focused on AI for research and data center development, it doesn't go any better than between business and government and future of technology. We're here to bring this event as well as many others. And today, Lucian, I'm sending this your way. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much, Jen, and I very much appreciate the support from the Potomac Institute. This study, this series of 4 webinars is absolutely critical time for our country right now. To have the Institute for Policy Studies working on this is essential. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time to work with us to put this on. I'm Lucian Niemeyer. For those of you who don't know me, although I run a nonprofit for cybersecurity, my background, I've got more formers and X's than I think Liz Taylor. So I'm a former White House official at Office of Management and Budget, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, former Senate staffer. I'm an Air Force vet and a couple others there. So I'm bringing together a background in national security and to really address what I think is one of the significant times in our nation's or actually world history as we look at new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, quantum, where we're going with virtual technologies and its relationship to the physical world. So we developed this series around the AI manufacturing base, realizing that artificial intelligence has a physical component and manufacturing base. And in this particular episode of 4, we're going to focus on a key and essential component of data and compute capability, which is energy, and the need for more energy. And really what we're seeing as an explosion in demand in this country. How can we manage that? What are the current concerns, particularly as we build out the manufacturing base? And we put Genesis mission in the title because for those of you who don't know, that's a recent presidential initiative to recognize the potential power of AI and to build a federal platform for that we can build a trust in the training of models. And ultimately a federal platform for the use of AI across all of society, healthcare, engineering. And the goal here is how do we build the secure and safe infrastructure to support Genesis that in itself will support the applications for AI. So in a nutshell, that is what we've been focusing on. We had an amazing webinar. Please go back and check our first webinar with Igor Yabanok, and he laid out our dreams, our goals. Please go back and check out this first one. We'll have 2 other ones after this. But today, we're going to focus on power. I hope I am not the only one on this webinar who has heard of the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, because it is one of the more important organizations to give us a perspective, an objective perspective, what is going on with the power needs of our country. So at first, I want to turn it over to John. And if you can just give us a quick background of your work with NERC, and then I'll turn it over to Josh for a little bit of your background. And then I want to start talking about the generational changes we're underway right now. So John, if you would go first and let the audience know a little bit more about yourself.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Lucian, and thank you for the invite and also the Potomac Institute for setting this webinar up. This really aligns with a lot of the messages we've been sending both to the government, to our stakeholders, to the general public around reliability. So I'll give you a little bit of background. I'm not a former really anything. I've been doing this since I got out of school. So 20 years at NERC, really looking at systems, looking at the interconnection-wide systems, looking at both adequacy and stability risk that we see on the grid. And really, the only thing that I think is that holds true over the last 20 years that I've been doing this is that the system's changing, right? So there's no constant in our system, and because of that changing, is the way we need to adapt to this new system conditions, the risk is increasing. And so at NERC, what we do is, what I think is extreme value, because we do what we call independent reliability assessments. And that really allows us to put the facts on the table, kind of skirt all of the state policies around choice of generation. We really get to be the voice of the physics of the system. And really, we've been publishing our long-term reliability assessment for like 60 years. And, for probably the past decade, they probably haven't been so interesting in that, we do a lot of the work. We kind of show that the system's got enough resources. We make some presentations, stay confident about our position on reliability. But, over the last couple of years, kind of starting around 2018, 2019, we started really seeing some risk on the system that was quite different than what we've seen for many years. And the story isn't just from recent. This is a decade old, where we retired generation, we brought new resources on, and because of the new resources, mostly solar, wind, batteries, the whole risk profile of the system has really changed, and has really culminated into some of the events we've seen recently, specifically during winter times, but also during summer conditions as well. So I do want to share with you. So I'm going to share a graphic here to help us follow along. Today I was at the FERC Open Commission meeting, presenting the same slide.
Yeah. Hey, John, before you do that, let's get Josh up, and then we'll go back to the slide. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and then what I like to do is also, I want to make sure I would love if you to give the audience kind of maybe like a 3-minute primer of how many grids we have in the country, and where do you see risk, things like that. But I want to make sure I get Josh's introduction first, and then we'll go back to that slide to pull it up. So Josh.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thanks to the Potomac Institute, as always, and to Jen and her team for pulling together consistently great events. And normally I'm in the audience, but it's fun to be on the other side of the table. And, I think for the purposes of this discussion, what's probably most relevant in my background was that, I started my career as a product manager. I'm a tech geek by background, though everyone's some version of a tech geek here. I'm just the software and infrastructure kind, and then subsequently became a venture capitalist. But one of the things that has been incredibly rewarding over the last 2 years is that here in New York, I've been leading a team that's put together what we call Empire AI, which at the moment is the largest academic supercomputer in the world that's specifically meant for incredibly high value AI oriented research. Our infrastructure itself lives in Buffalo, New York, not far from Niagara Falls. That's not an accident. And it's meant to be what's referred to as a frontier class system. So the latest and greatest at this point NVIDIA gear lives there specifically to work with a subset of researchers every single day on their highest order problems, whether that's in healthcare or energy, computer science, and fundamentally trying to make new discoveries. But the project started 2 years ago. It's disproportionately funded by the state of New York. It's a $650 million effort. It has its first 2 clusters online, and it's been super exciting. And a lot of the work we do now is about kind of turning it into a national model for what AI supercomputing can look like. So we'll obviously talk more about it, but hopefully, Lucian, that can suffice for now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, that's exactly what we're talking about, the Genesis mission, right? A national model that we can have trust in as far as the platform itself. Okay, John, because I definitely want the audience to understand, where we're looking at risk and what you see right now, where we have in the regions of the world or the country the most risk. And I say North America, right? Because we share our grid with Canada. So John, can you bring that slide up you were talking about?
Coming right up.
Yeah, thank you so much.
There we go.
Yep, that's exactly what I was hoping you'd bring up.
All right. Well, wonderful. I think that helps set the stage. And again, this type of risk assessment is not a prediction, right? We're not predicting that there's going to be outages. We're really, no one can really do that. What we can do is look at the risk factors, and what's really evident, really clear, is that there are headwind risk factors that are impacting our ability to maintain a reliable system in the future. And we've really never been here. This map, we started putting this together just about a decade ago, and there's only one or two areas that we would grade as elevated risk. And I think so. It's probably important to talk a little bit, orient the participants, audience around the colors and the grid. So, basics. There are four interconnections in North America, three in the U.S., the east to west, and Texas, and then Quebec is its own interconnection, but of course tied into the North American bulk power system. Each of what you're seeing here are assessment areas. Sometimes they're groups of vertically integrated utilities. You'll find that in the south and the west. And also you'll find some of our assessment areas are actually ISO RTOs, which are market areas, wholesale market areas, where a lot of the older vertically utilities have been unbundled their resources and now have the markets to support that. And it's kind of no surprise there that because of the resource mix change and the rapid load growth that we're seeing here, it's really the market areas that have challenges in setting the right price, reliability, and incentives signals to the market so that the right types of resources can be added to the system. And so let me orient on the color. So normal risk, you can never reduce risk. Normal risk, all these areas both meet the local resource adequacy requirements. So we have adequacy requirements in kind of every jurisdiction at the state and the market levels. The elevated risk area means, they met their reserve requirements. But when you kind of look at some extreme cases, extreme scenarios, and it's kind of hard to say that extremes are the new normal. I'm not going to say that, but extremes, the ones that we've seen probably every year, and you can name them: Uri, Elliot, Heather, Jerry, Fern, right? It sounds kind of like a band called the Polar Vortex, right? I remember, and these storms have all shown that extreme weather, particularly winter, can really have some significant risk on the system and really be catastrophic for everyone that needs electricity. And of course, today we all need electricity. One of my favorite quotes around the electricity, and I think it resonates with your audience here, is if you look at the electricity sector, we're only 7% of the GDP, right? But we're the first 7%, right? Without that electricity, nothing else happens, and we're so much more reliant on electricity than we ever have been. That's why these assessments are so important, right? They're fact-based. We're looking at actual resources that are coming in. We're looking at all the energy constraints, right? Not every resource can provide power at all hours of the day. Wind, we know, is variable. Solar, we know with pretty good prediction that around 6 o'clock, the sun's going to go down and we have to switch to batteries, which are limited in many areas. So the whole resource base that we've used to rely on electricity and guarantee reliability, has some challenges, and those aren't an indictment of those resources. Those characteristics need to be carefully planned and managed and integrated.
Yeah. So I got a question on this. Josh is in New York. I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm in Western Prince William County, Virginia. So I got more data centers within about 8 miles of me than anywhere in the whole world.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, the power's starting to go out. Dominion is having a hard time right now with the winter storms. So we've had 3 power outages at a local school recently. My PJM has made news recently by an action by the president to force a new bid or process for buying power. People don't realize that the companies that are providing us the power are bidding for or prices, or they're buying their power actually a year or two prior based on anticipated load. Right now, PJM is a little bit of a crisis. Actually, the New Jersey governor's race was around electricity, the exploding prices of electricity. John, in just a couple minutes, can you give us a little general sense, okay, what is being done to manage or to address what is perceived or misperceived as the impact of data centers on electricity prices?
Yeah, great. And we don't typically get into the prices, but
I
the
got
prices often reflect the constraints of the energy, and so we'll kind of stay in that realm. So we've been connecting large loads for decades. We have a lot of experience with that. But kind of here's how the story went about 20 years ago. You call a bill at the mom and pop utility and say, hey, I got this 100 megawatt paper mill I want to connect, and then utility would say, sure, great. How long will it take you to pay, to build a paper mill? And they say about 8 years. And the utility said, well, great. That's about how long it'll take to build the necessary infrastructure to support that. And so it's gone on like that for decades, and we've been wildly successful working in large load growth throughout the decades. But the load growth we're seeing is quite different, right? These are loads that can show up almost overnight. They're ready to go. We have chipsets in data warehouses that are built, constructed without the switchgear and without the approval to actually connect, right? So they were building the data centers much quicker than we can build the infrastructure to support it, and that's really the heart of the challenge. And then so how do you actually incentivize the right generation quickly, knowing that there are real hurdles, physical and logistical implications to actually getting the turbines, getting the switchgear, upgrading the upgrading transmission facilities so that you can allow those larger, right? So having a very large load come in, essentially overnight, doesn't quite work with the physics and the logistics that we have on ordering and actually constructing all the equipment needed to support it.
Yeah, and I think that came out clear. And again, anybody online that wants to learn more, please download and read the most recent long range document from NERC. It's eye-opening. So, Josh, we were preparing for this, and you started using the term generational in the way that I think is unique. And so, can you expound upon it? I know I would like to find out you're building an amazing enterprise up there at Empire AI. How are you looking at power? And more importantly, is we're using the term generation in a lot of different ways. So expound upon that a little bit, how you're looking at it.
Yeah, well, I think for the sake of this discussion, so much of what's in the national narrative, or at least you see in state legislatures at the moment, is this whole notion that data centers are what are driving up consumer energy prices. Now, I think that we can all acknowledge that's not quite right. That in fact there are a total number of things that have contributed to that. Data centers in some ways being but a piece of it. And so ultimately the first use of the term always is the consequence of like, well, we just stopped building new generating capacity as a fundamental reality. Certainly that's the case in New York. And we're blessed with Niagara Falls, and the hydro there, which is just truly incredible. I'm always like kind of tickled by the fact that we really do turn on and off Niagara Falls every day to help with generation. But necessarily, that is the debate that I think so many of us wish we could have, and not making it about these other abstract realities or backlash to big tech, because certainly from our perspective, we believe deeply in the power of artificial intelligence to advance discovery and scientific research and the national security component associated with it. But that then necessarily begets this other reality, which is that, in some ways, I think there's an entire generational shift in our thinking. It's so fun for me and in my day job watching our software teams think now all of a sudden about, well, what if you actually could insert an LLM into the code? Do we now not have to sit and think through every algorithmic reality that we need to script and what the logic is? You stop having to have some of these debates, and you start actually getting to use new tools and advance things so much faster or more efficiently or more productively. But that really does require a generational transformation in thinking. So in the day-to-day at Empire AI, funny enough, it's about a new generation of the technology, right? That's sort of usually associated with GPU evolution. But it's also this component of how do we get researchers to understand that the unit of compute now looks totally different as well. And necessarily, they, like any user of a tool, kind of size their experiments relative to the size of the instrument or the availability of the instrument you have. And we end up having to spend an extraordinary amount of time being like, no, I don't think of this as a one GPU job. or a 2 GPU job, or if you were blessed an 8 GPU job, like you're about to get 120 GPUs. What is the scientific question you want those 120 or those 1,000 GPUs to be answering? And that has also required that sort of generational shift in thinking. It's incredibly exciting. It's also a bit of early days. And for us, 2 years ago, we had to do the, well, if we build it, they'll come. Now we don't have that problem. It's kind of been amazing for these 9 New York-based institutions. Those PIs, those researchers do get to quite literally have moved from 1 GPU, maybe a little bit of, a cloud provider, to where now they're running on 20, 30 GPUs. And so our prodding is to say, no, try 120. We're not going to push you to 1,000 just yet. Try 120 for us.
So I think even though we did not talk about this in the pre-briefs, I think you and I are having a little bit of a mind melt. So bear with me on this question because I think you'll see where it's going. Today, a typical GPU, those of us who measure it's packets per second, right? How many packets per second can you put out? Anywhere between 11 to 15. Some folks can say Blackwell does 32. And there's alternate GPU technology, and there's a certain amount of wattage or power that goes in to get that packet per second. And now there's looking at new technologies where we're going to do thousands of packets per second, at 10% of the energy input. And I think that's within the realm, particularly with digital twinning, and I think we can get to that point. My belief is that we're going to need more compute. So in other words, we're never going to see a scenario where, okay, now I can put so many more packets per second through. I only need 10% of the power. Therefore, we're going to see power demands for this country go down. I see the opposite, that the power is going to continue to go up. We're just going to want to use more compute. What's your perspective on that?
It's nuanced. I think that for me, where you see these incredible power curves really come from this thought that we're going to continue to train foundational models, again and again and again. And I think folks who watch the space closely, if you query 25 of them, you're going to get 25 different opinions on sort of how many large models do we really need, and what does that look like, and how do we get more either efficient or productive, or what can we in fact absorb, at least in the enterprise in the United States, vis-a-vis these foundational models. And certainly I personally want to see to it that it's not just 2, right? Or 3. It can't just be OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and that's it. That would be a real problem for our base. But nevertheless, those are the most hungry consumers. I think, for me, for our project, what's kind of interesting is you're totally right, Lucian, how people think about it. We have this luxury of physics of the speed of light is our issue. And so to compress quite literally the equipment together physically really, really matters, because we can't have that loss. So that's your sort of packet version of things. So we try to think of it instead as, relevant to this conversation, units of compute per watt, because that truly is our throughput issue. Yeah. And so there's this bit of
that's that's where I was going with the question. Yeah, totally.
Like, I hope we can kind of move to that as a country, because everyone will have as a global landscape as we talk about this kind of compute, because how you network your gear matters. So we get to worry about the physics that doesn't always make sense. And then there's this nuance that we can go into if you want, but it's always the nuance of, well, what's a GPU versus, what Google will tell you is a TPU, but obviously others have their flavors of it, where that's their inferencing engine as opposed to their training engine. The energy needs of a training engine looking really different, but also the latency imposed by networks really mattering when it's your day-to-day use of a model. So you would want your training engines to exist in more places. Your training engines don't need to exist in more places. Your inferencing engines need to exist as close to, let's call it, the end user as possible. And some of those are the real factors we think of, because if you can put your training systems in a high load area, you could put your inferencing systems in places where perhaps the grid isn't as built out. And some of those are the key questions that I think we're going to have to explore over these next couple of years. Because you're right, like these are such amazing tools of productivity that the utilization across our consumer base, across the global landscape, isn't going to go down. But the question is, how much more energy do we really need as we go through that curve of making it useful?
So you hit a solution there. I know, Jen, did you just want, because I want to make sure I get a quick response from John. Jen, did you have a question on that, or can I hit
I just wanted to build on and see if either any of the three of you could help put this in perspective. So this isn't the first time our country's had an energy crisis as we've gone into a revolution. And so the Industrial Revolution took up more power than we knew it could even exist and that we could generate. And so can somebody help liken what was happening then to what's happening now as we're facing a reindustrialization here in the United States?
Yeah, and maybe I can start because the kind of generational thinking and kind of setting up for a new modern way of life, I think, is this moment in time. But that generational thinking is not going to happen because we haven't built generation in the past decade, right? Which I think is the critical key. Industrial revolution, all hands on deck, building as much as possible, as quickly as possible, cleaning up the pieces kind of along the way, but everybody oriented towards the goal. Here today, much different story. Over the last 10 years, we haven't really built any dispatchable resources that are really good at any time, winter time. Of course, we built some gas generation, but the primary source has been wind and solar. And when we're thinking about the inferencing or the training, some of these are occurring 24 hours a day. We're using AI in different ways that are life critical and some or financially critical. Those are going to be operating all hours, right? And so solar and wind and even batteries aren't really by themselves aren't going to take care of the challenge that we had really even in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, and I think we are at a point. Remember, way back when we had the rural electric cooperative, and we had ways to electrify this country and to be able to generate the capacity and the distribution to be able to meet a country that was growing industrially. We have much more of an arcane and bureaucratic regulatory process right now that limits that, not just that generation, John, but as you know, transmission distribution. I mean, what was the ungodly number of how many transmission miles we built last year or the year before? It was like 56. I mean, it was an unbelievably low number. So we not only have a generation issue, we also have a transmission. John, there was one thing that Josh mentioned that I just want to make sure I get your perspective on. You're looking long term. So do you account for what may happen in the data world as the output per watt reduces over time? Do you roll that into your calculations that based on a current GPU or based on where the future is going, or do you rely on the sector experts to give you input what they think they're going to need for power 10 years from now?
Yeah, so it's a really important question because NERC doesn't do independent forecasting. We really rely on the individual utilities. They know their systems best. And what's clear is, there's not a lot of experience with especially the types of compute we're doing. Certainly, certain areas have a lot of compute experience in your area, but we're finding actually some operational issues where data centers have tripped offline, created some system challenges, different consumption profiles. We're kind of learning all about that. So a lot of that isn't included, right? We kind of see the block of a request, 200 megawatt data center, 500 megawatt data center. And from what we know about load interconnection requests, we expect 500 or 200 or 500 megawatts round the clock all the time. Now, as we get closer to the time, we start having, the utilities start the dialogue with the actual end user and say, okay, well, what's your profile? Can you shift things around? Can I incentivize you to kind of move things towards later in the day, middle of the night, right? Those conversations happen, and then these load forecasts start adjusting, and we kind of start learning. But over time, even if a data center comes in 500 megawatts, day one is not going to be 500 megawatts. Is kind of what we hear. You kind of creep up into that, and over time, you work your way up to that. But it's only a matter of time, right? And I think that there's unlimited ideas to be powering all the compute that's needed.
Hey, Josh, you said something to me that keeps staying in my mind as I'm listening to John. I'm hoping you're there. I'm not sure if I can see your screen, but I'm hoping you're still on.
Oh yeah.
You mentioned the different applications for AI, training, inference. I mean, do you think we're at a point of maturity just within what you're doing with Empire that we can start going to what Jen asked for, which is a national plan? We need to be, look at this where we start separating classes of data centers and we start being much more proactive about where we position those. And ultimately, to be able to address John's concerns, we start being deliberate about, inference data centers versus learning data centers for AI. And we probably need to get much more, I would say, organized, not regulated. I don't want to use that word, organized on how
Yeah.
we place these around the country. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, no, you couldn't have said it better. I mean, I think that that's something that I deeply believe. I think a lot of us believe in, we've been productively engaging with NSF and White House OSTP and the groups that are really trying to think through what is this next generation. And as a country, we have a little bit of history of this. We set up a sequence of supercomputing centers in the 70s, and probably the most famous of them is at the University of Illinois and the National Center for Supercomputing that gave us Netscape and so much in the internet revolution. And I think the view is that we absolutely do need to do this. We've kind of lost our edge as a country in having this mix of hardware, essentially, right? Your frontier class systems, your production systems. And so our argument is generally speaking, at least when we're talking about really computationally intensive discovery tasks, there ought to be some number. It's a number lower than 10 of these systems that need to exist in the United States as a competitive asset. And then there's a set of commoditized resources that need to exist. And then,
Yeah.
of course, you have the very well-established cloud offerings that, by the way, those are focused on inference. One of the things we like to talk about when we think about Empire AI is sort of the incentive structures. For a researcher to use, let's say, AWS, well, they're getting billed incrementally by the unit of service, and AWS is happy to accommodate the customer in that way and give them as much as they can use. For us, we're hardware constrained. And so therefore it forces us to impose a discipline on these researchers and how they think about the computational
Mhm.
resources. And that's a really different way you build out your hardware. So even when we think about that national landscape informed by what we've learned, we've sort of said, you actually should do, let's say you're going to build 5 or 6 of these frontier class systems. Each one should actually have a slightly different infrastructure configuration. And you then take the work and you essentially assign it to the machine that's best for that given application.
Right.
And that's
Do you
not a
think
new model, right? I mean, we do that with a whole lot of other industries, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think I mean I'm sure the hyperscalers are all thinking this through because of the fact that in some locations they need a data center with near zero latency. Other cases they can live with a little bit more variation. I'm just wondering
Well,
how
to
much
that
of
point, Lucian, it's even more fun than that. Like they
yeah,
actually have training systems. It's
yeah,
just only for their use.
yeah,
So when
yeah,
you go and you're renting cloud services, it's more the inference production stuff, right? It's
yeah,
not the like foundational training.
yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking, Jen, moving beyond this series, what do we make recommendations? I think we probably do need to go down that course a little bit about what could be done by the industry to regulate themselves, or at least the master plan, where they put capabilities internally, training capability internally, that ultimately lessens the demands on the grid, particularly in areas where we're really strained, like PJM, in Eastern Seaboard. Um, John, I mean, I know you strictly take your predictions from what the intakes or on take forms are coming in from the utilities, right? Is that how you're driving most of your long-term analysis?
Yeah, that's one of the primary ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering now, are the utilities asking those questions as far as, okay, are there parts of the country or in our operating area where you could go where we don't necessarily have a latency concern? Obviously, when you have a data center supporting financial markets, it's got to be near zero latency, but when you're doing other things, you don't need it. So I think that's something we may want to pursue. I'm not asking a question here. I'm just thinking to myself, that's something we may want to be maybe driving policy towards. Obviously, we're the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies that we can be looking at a policy recommendation there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead,
was
John.
just going to build on that note that my question about the Industrial Revolution led me to spend another second doing research here. It was about the end of that Industrial Revolution that the United States put energy in as a utility across the country. And so in talking about that history and the evolution and where we ended up today, and some of the lack of modernization in our energy grid is due to the fact that we have capped the profits of our energy companies, so they have not been able to reinvest and recapitalize into something newer and better. As we look to a future, does it then make sense to reconsider what we have as utilities and how they're provided out to the nation, especially when it comes to energy?
That's a loaded question. John, you want to take a run at that, or Josh?
It can be a rhetorical question. I'm okay with
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
just wanted to put it out.
Yeah, no, I think the thing that resonates with me the most, the biggest constraint that we have in front of us is the timing and our current processes that really weren't up for this type of growth. You know, the sheer logistics, amount of workers, the siting, permitting for new transmission, all of that just takes a long, long time. 10 years for transmission, 5 to 7 years for generation, assuming you are already in line for a turbine. There's all these challenges in actually bringing the infrastructure online. And so from the utilities perspective, you know, they see the load forecast come in, and the challenge really isn't so much the reliability challenge, because the reliability solution is to not interconnect them, right? To defer, to delay them, right? That's how we're going to manage the reliability challenge. It would be a reliability challenge if we connected them, didn't have enough generation, had to curtail them often, not good quality of service, all that. So we maintain reliability by deferring them, and they will get deferred and deferred and deferred until the necessary equipment, generation, and transmission is in place to support it. So from a policy perspective, how do you speed up that timeline? How do you work in a solution that you could build a compute in a reliable way, power it reliably, and do it so that, you know, we've heard a lot of the self supply strategy, and that'll certainly get you somewhere, but you really never get to the reliability that the grid provides,
Yeah.
right? So we're so happy that the data centers want to, you know, connect to the North American bulk power system because of its high reliability, right? That it would be so expensive to self-supply to get that same level of reliability. But there's a challenge in the timing, right? We don't get to that level of reliability without all the protections, all the studies, and all the processing of, you know, permitting, siting, and all. You don't kind of get to there without all that. So those are the challenge. How do you kind of do that in parallel, or in you know, a very directed way?
Yeah, we're not
So,
also fortunate to have Niagara Falls in our backyard,
yeah, I know
Josh.
that's where I was going to go. Because I have a lot to say on that topic. John, you've teed me up perfectly for the next thing I want to talk about. But I wanted to give Josh an opportunity. So, yeah, you're right. Niagara Falls, amazing. Thank God for that. You know, I love the place. How else are you looking at for Empire? Do you feel like you have the electricity challenges, and are you doing some planning for any other type of generation or even behind the meter generation? What's your thoughts right now?
Yeah, I mean, again, we have the luxury of sitting there next to, you know, really just a natural wonder of the world by every definition, including its ability to generate power. And so, as a consequence, we don't think a lot about it, but I think it's also worth saying that we don't think a lot about it because these research computers, again, physics, right? Speed of light, that's our limitation. They're pretty small.
Okay.
And so consequently, you know, right now, when you look out over the 10-year plan for the program, even if we pretend that there's something like Moore's law over energy demands for these GPUs, we're looking at a 15 megawatt
Yeah.
facility.
Yeah.
And
Gotcha.
right, and
Yeah.
so it's just on a different order of
Yeah, I
scale.
gotcha. I gotcha.
And so that's a little different. You know, it does mean we think a lot about what does heat look like. So for Empire AI, the waste heat gets pumped into the campus loop at the University of Buffalo, which is amazing. It creates all sorts of new efficiencies as a consequence of that because you've got this little heat generator working at all times. It just happens to do something productive
Yep.
while it's
No.
generating that heat. And that's kind of how we tend to get to think about it. So if you want to talk about geothermal wells, we can do that too. But
Oh gosh, that's
um,
part
but
of our
point
solution
is,
too.
but
Wherever we
point
can get
is, you know,
geothermal.
these things all go together
Yeah.
in kind of important ways for us.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, look, you know, what's grown up in this area are all the 20 and 30 meg data centers. I mean, they're relatively small. Now, collectively, they're putting a strain on Dominion's grid, but you know, right now what we're faced with, and John knows this, and we're looking at 2 gig, 3 gig data center complexes going up in
Yeah.
Ohio, Texas, everywhere. And in a lot of cases, they're doing behind the meter generation. But you're right. It is the onesies and twosies that are tough, but it's the big ones that are right now putting some stress across
Yeah.
the system nationally. I want to follow up on John, something you said about timing. I think we're in a real tough situation right now because it's normally a power company that ends up doing the investments in new generation. You look at Southern, they ate Vogtle 1 and 2 for years. $37 billion for the two new power plants down there, nuclear power plants. But they unfortunately passed on the ratepayers. So there was ratepayer fatigue. Now they're doing great now that the units are up. But utilities are at a point where they would historically have been looked at to be the primary mover for new generation. And at the time when electricity prices are already high and going up, see, utilities really don't have the ability to quick turn investments or any type of capital to start building new generation. I think you're seeing that right now more than anything, right? And so we got to start looking for some innovative solutions. I have an innovative solution I'll talk about in a minute, but I just want to give you a chance to talk about a little bit what you're seeing finance-wise. I know you don't get into the prices, but you realize that not a lot of utilities around the country have a cap reserve that they can start building new power plants tomorrow.
Yeah, and they don't. So this is all brand new. Interesting things that are happening in Georgia. Certainly, it's not a market area. I just got a notification that my rate is proposed to actually go down. Rates going down in Georgia. So they've done some interesting things around how they are balancing all the new load requests and building really the right types of generation for to kind of meet the demand.
Yeah, God bless those AP 1000s that are now operating at full capacity down there in Vogtle and gonna hopefully I think that's the reason why your prices are coming down because they're finally up and operating and we've gotten past the capital hump.
Yeah.
That was a huge investment by Southern, almost cost them a lot. And unfortunately they had to pass them on the ratepayer. So I'm glad to hear some of that's changing. You're in Atlanta, right?
Yeah, in Atlanta. Now the interesting thing is because you mentioned utilities, and we kind of think about the larger ones, but the ones that are it's really the co-ops that are really interested in bringing the large loads online. A lot of interest. Now they don't have a lot of the infrastructure, right? But they kind of have some DNA, if you will, from those older times where they propped up electricity to farmers that couldn't get power. So they built grids. They know how to build grids. But there's a lot of them, and there's interest in those utilities, those co-op utilities, to bring them on. But they also don't have the cap structures the way that larger utilities do.
Okay, so I want to talk about a concept that's emerging pretty significantly, particularly in the data center world, and that's behind the meter generation. Just for the audience, since you're much more of an expert than I am, can you briefly describe what behind the meter means?
Is that me? That's me.
Yeah, John.
Yeah. So everything, the customer meter, right at that point, there might be generation behind it. So local, almost every data center comes with standard package, comes with diesel generators or a large storage. They have backup generators. Hospital facilities, our solar panels on my roof are behind the meter distributed energy resources. So they're resources that the operator doesn't necessarily know about. They kind of, they don't really have control over them, but they are an asset. And they can be set up. And we've seen some new data center agreements where you're really trading time for flexibility, meaning I can connect you quicker if you agree that to be flexible and maybe shift your energy to the nighttime or curtail during peak conditions, right? So there's some incentives for being flexible, using some of your behind the meter generation to support that.
Yeah. Okay. Spot question for you. Did you ever think in your lifetime that 3 Mile Island Reactor 1 would ever be reopened?
Very interesting, right? So new times, but really, what I think what that signals is how do we get back into the nuclear race here and start bringing on new AP 1000s or others on.
And,
Did
and
you ever
there's
think they'd be funded by
articles in
Microsoft? And that's the amazing part. You got Microsoft that's willing to take on the optics.
Incredible. Yeah. Well, and so what that signals too is the long-term durable customer that will be there, right? Which has kind of been at the heart of a lot of the consternation. Will they be there? Will the load just disappear? Right. But you have these kind of bilateral deals being struck that are 20, 30 years.
It's pretty incredible. So you look around the country, we've done a reversal. I don't know if you heard recently where the German chancellor basically said, I wish we had kept our nuclear open. We have, in some cases, made that decision. Other than Indian Point, that's too far gone up in New York. That's in your area, Josh. But Palisades in Michigan, Diablo in California staying open. Now we're looking at reopening the Arnold reactors in Iowa. So we're starting to look at legacy nuclear. But you've got hyperscalers wanting to invest the money. They want to invest billions on maintaining either nuclear power plants. You got XAI down in Memphis or right outside of Memphis just bought a gas plant in Mississippi, and they're restoring that. So you've got private sector investment outside the utilities. That's where I wanted to go with the question. Is now you've got private sector investment saying, you know what, we need to do this. Stargate, which was a big announcement, OpenAI, that is they're building their own power generation. Now they're on the ERCOT grid. I don't know why that's going to work or how, but they're still looking at large gas generation for those data centers. So behind the meter, I think is emerging. The question is, and this goes, Josh, you and I were talking about what New York just put in on a moratorium, through a potential in a bill. Should we continue to look at behind the meter generation, or do we ultimately just put a pause on data centers? What's your thoughts on that, Josh?
Well, certainly, I think this thought of blanket pauses is misguided, right? That doesn't serve anybody. It doesn't serve the interests of the public. It doesn't advance us in any way. A pause is a pause, and it's a blunt instrument. So, and the simple reality is here in New York, I don't foresee that having much success at all, but it certainly gets headlines. That came mere days after the governor in her State of the State announced a major initiative to look at bringing online new nuclear capability here in the state of New York, which included public funding being brought to bear to support those efforts. And she did that with a whole set of stakeholders. So it's the sort of thing in New York where maybe we're a little schizophrenic about how we talk about it, but certainly the state executive is very keen on turning on new capacity. Now, for some of these behind the meter applications, I'm thinking of when you're thinking of natural gas, right? And building near pipelines, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we're seeing that in the Pacific Northwest, even though they have hydro too, right? But you can certainly see it in North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana. That makes a lot of sense, I would argue, right? And it's a good application. It's very clear. Certainly when you talk about hydro, it's a little less clear. Won't see us turning on new hydro capacity anytime soon in the country,
right now. Yeah,
and then I guess if we were all to put on a Silicon Valley hat, which I don't think any of us wear by default, but if we're to try to pretend that there's one, it's these micro reactors, right? That they're really trying to push and accelerate. And yet, as I said earlier in the call, maybe one of the most unusual and interesting things is the push right now by the federal government to figure out how to create generating capacity on federal land for the purposes
my
of
Lord.
advancing AI, right? And like that's a whole
up.
nother.
You just yeah.
Well,
I don't
in
know
terms
do a
of
home run here on yeah. So Josh, thank you for that because that is I think an exciting initiative, and I've talked to John about this too. The fact that we potentially could put gigawatts of generation on federal installations that have a reduced regulatory requirement, particularly if we keep those electrons on that installation by co-locating large scale data centers. I've been working on that for about a year and a half. I think that's part of the future. That when I mentioned behind the meter, that if this country has gigawatts of compute needs, particularly for the Genesis mission, the way to satisfy that, and John, to get to your point, we can't continue to put pressure on the grid, or is to basically start building these large scale generation plants on federal stations right next to the data centers that are going to be used for Genesis, and then build them quickly, and build all fuel sources. You brought up geothermal, hell yeah. I hate to say this, I know you guys are probably a little more clean energy than I am. Coal's coming back. Where can we
It's been coming
potentially
back.
short term, you have put it next to a rail line, start building a coal plant. There's some equipment laying out there right now that we can definitely reconstitute. The reason why I'm bringing this up is that we are in a national power emergency. I can say it. John, you may not be able to say it, but it sure comes through in your report that we have a national power emergency. So we've got to be innovative. We have to be innovative. And ultimately, where can we apply private capital, not ratepayer dollars, private capital to build out not just the compute capability, but to build out the power to go with that.
Yeah.
Now, we still have the same supply chain issues. As you know, John, we haven't talked about this. It's tough to get a gas turbine right now anywhere in the country, or switch gear or transformers. but a lot of that switchgear and transformers is for distribution and transmission. If we put those two right next to each other, we cut down on transmission risk.
Yeah.
So Josh, my God, thank you for teeing that up because I think that is something that we need to look at moving forward on how do we look at innovative ways to use federal land, BLM land, DOI land, forestry land. That's not ultimately going to create an environmental concern, but where we have land that works with gas lines nearby that we can start developing privately. John, what do you think?
And I think that aligns with something we've said in the past, where we've got now experience building modern nuclear. We built 1, 2 units. We need to figure out how to build 20, right? Incremental new nuclear is really going to make a dent. To even the largest 2,000 megawatt nuclear facilities, or a little bit larger, there's only a fraction of the demand that we're coming. So we really got to get good at building nuclear, and how can we do that 20 times consecutively? And I think that aligns with some of those solutions that you're putting out.
Yeah, I think, and look, Josh mentioned the microreactors. This is just for the audience. A microreactor is an advanced reactor, but about 20 to 30 meg versus output. When you and I, John, were talking AP1000, that's 1.1 gig. You're talking, what Natrium is putting in, TerraPower is putting in, that's about going to be about 400. GE Hitachi is making a 300 meg reactor. So I think, Josh mentioned the micros, and there's a market for those, particularly for distributed generation for really zero latency, 5 9 uptime data centers that are distributed around the country. But there's also a huge market for more AP1000s. And so the president did put forth a executive order talking about more large reactor development. To me, we can only max out sites so much. Palisades maybe put two more up. We'll see what Vogtle could do, maybe another two down your way in Georgia. But there's not a lot of locations in the private sector where we can start plopping down Gen 3 nuclear reactors or even Gen 3 5. So I definitely think federal land is the way to go as far as finding something on the back 40, like 40,000 acres at INL, Idaho National Lab, where we can start now today, starting construction on those up to 10 gig worth of power. So I think that's a solution because we really don't want to be on a webinar talk only about the problems we have and the challenges, but ultimately where are solutions. I think we brought up earlier that we can bring the amount of power we use down, but then we ultimately have to look for innovative ways to generate more power.
Yeah, and I want to come back to a comment that all three of you have made throughout, and it's a theme of reliability, right? So it's not just for the power grid for consumers, but it's the reliability of that power for the data centers, for the compute that's going to be needed. And that comes back to the military needs their reliability of their power and their AI to run for things that they're going to be doing. One of the questions was related to the amount of compute and power needed for something like Golden Dome as compared to Genesis mission. And while it's not really well defined yet, there's no secret that there's going to be a lot of power consumption needed to do what they're talking about doing. And so where's that going to come from? Right now, it's hard to imagine pulling more from the grid that we're already taxing.
Yeah, Jen. So we need that study because I know the Institute is doing some work on that. We need more of that. I spent a lot of time in the Department of War. I'm not sure they understand what they're going to use AI for when it comes to Golden Dome. We know I could give you 10 different things, reasons why you want to have AI enabling us to be able to do target detection and everything else, or at least adversary detection. But there's more work to come that we in the Institute need to do on defining what that is. What are the AI requirements going to be, particularly near zero latency AI, and how much, where do we need it? How close to the fight do we need it? Do we need it in Greenland, or do we need it at Vandenberg, California, or do we need it over up in Clear, Alaska? But more importantly is not just what we need, but how much of it. I think that's still the
And how distributed can it be?
yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah, and look, we're still putting together the Golden Dome framework, so it's there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. Hey, I offered you all both one last question. If you were king for a day, give me an opportunity to either for Empire, what's your future? If you're king for a day, Josh, how do you get there? And then John, I'll close you out if you're a king for a day.
Mine's really straightforward because you ended up talking me into it already, Lucian. It's to actually build a couple more of these things. We talk about Empire AI the way people talk about research telescopes and particle accelerators because it ends up just really simplifying. What do we do? What should it look like? But as a nation, we stopped building these things. Chinese are building them en masse. The Gulf states are building them en masse. We've stopped. And so, King for a day is let's just empower the research community, which, by the way, isn't just academia, right? That's industry too. But let's empower them to have access to these frontier systems that they need to continue to innovate and continue to make these new discoveries, because that's kind of a huge part of what's made America so special and great. We've been the land of invention for so many
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
and we want to keep that edge.
Before you get to we get to John, I do want to ask you a quick question. I don't not mean to put you in the spot, but Empire AI is one of the leading programs in the country. Are you interacting with the Genesis Consortium, the Genesis Mission Consortium?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Want to make
yeah.
sure you're hooked in.
And there's this other thing called NER, and which is also coming out of the same set of executive orders in many ways. There's a multitude of these programs, but what I use as the guide is who is buying the frontier class systems from the manufacturers. There's not
Okay.
a lot of new capacity getting turned
Okay.
on.
All right. John, you're king for a day. I know you represent NERC, so you probably have to limit yourself. But if you were king for a day, what would you want to be focused on right now?
Yeah, such a tough question, right? Because there's no kings in the U.S. or across North America. But it got me thinking about, my trip to Morocco just a couple of years ago, where they do have a king. And he was doing exactly what Josh indicated. Build this, build that. And, telling in kind of our information exchange, the concept of not building the infrastructure needed for reliable electricity system because of public opposition or land rights or land disputes. It just was completely foreign to them, right? So this idea that when you're king and when your number one goal is to both maintain reliability but also do these pretty amazing aspirational goals around AI dominance and energy dominance. When you try to combine those two, do you need to build? So that's
Yeah.
that's what I would do.
Yeah. All right. And then I'm going to ask myself that question if I were king for a day. And I'm going to go along with what you both said. We face a generational opportunity here. I would want to focus on something that Jen mentioned, reliability of our grid. No matter what we do when we build out, no matter what the technology is, we got to keep the lights on because when the lights go out, people die. And so I would be making sure that we're marshaling all the resources we have in this country towards maintaining growth and reliability. Jen hit on it. Another half hour on our call, we could have been really spending time on reliability. And we may need to make that another part of the series. But we have to ensure the number one goals. We are not worried about climate. We're worried about keeping the lights on for our kids and making sure they have enough power. So I'll end there. Jen, I'm not sure if you have any final words.
I just wanted to thank all three of you for joining us today. This has been another fantastic discussion. And to the audience, stay tuned for episode 3.
All right. Appreciate it. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
all.
much,
Thank
Josh
you
and John,
guys.
for
Take
your
care.
expertise. Yep.